I can't be more clear. NATO's door is open, remains open, and that is our commitment. Right now, the document is with them, and the ball is in their court. We'll see what we do, as I've said repeatedly, whether they choose the path of diplomacy and dialogue, whether they decide to renew aggression against Ukraine, we're prepared either way.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. Ukraine. Will Russia invade? Is Russia about to face massive sanctions as it challenges NATO and Europe? How should the U.S. rise to the challenge of President Putin, who seems to want to erase the collapse of the Soviet Union and has illusions of some kind of imperialistic Russian dominance of a sphere of influence? We'll talk to the former U.S. National Security Advisor, John Bolton, and later, the former Prime Minister of Russia, who served under Putin for 4 years. Great insight on this backstory. All right, John Bolton was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, and he also served as the National Security Advisor to former President Trump, and he also is the author of the book, The Room Where It Happened. Hello, Mr. Ambassador.
Hi, good morning. Glad to be with you.
John, you just wrote an article in the New York Post. I know you do a lot of editorials, but that when you said, in a stroke, Biden demonstrated he didn't understand his own Ukraine policy, undercut Kiev's government and people, and handed Moscow an engraved invitation to make a minor incursion into Ukraine. What do you mean they're a minor incursion?
Well, that, of course, is Biden's term where he said it's one thing if they do an all-out invasion, but on the other hand, if it's just a minor incursion, then NATO won't know what to do. Now, that happens to be, unfortunately, an accurate statement. As we've seen from the evolution of Germany's position, there's hardly NATO unity here, but it's certainly not what a president of the United States ought to do, and he certainly ought not to appear to condone any kind of incursion into Ukraine.
But then he did clarify that afterwards, where the White House came out with a statement and said and then I think Mr. President Biden also said it a couple of days later, he said any movement of those massed troops on the border into Ukraine would trigger, massive retaliation in terms of sanctions.
Yeah, well, you know what they call the definition of a Washington gaffe? It's when a politician inadvertently tells the truth. And I think what we had here was Biden inadvertently perhaps saying what was on his mind. And, when you come to clean it up later, it simply feeds into the confusion about exactly what we're intending to do. I mean, I think the NATO position here is becoming less clear as time goes on. We have Biden again within the past 24 hours saying no further U.S. forces are going to Ukraine. This is another unforced error, even if that's the correct policy. You don't give it away for free, in effect. So I think, unfortunately, the momentum, the initiative here still rests with Putin. I don't think actually he's made a final decision what he will do, but he's looking to gain the maximum advantage, whether it's just in Ukraine, whether it's more broadly in the space of the former Soviet Union, or whether it's aimed at NATO, still looking to get what he can at the lowest cost.
If you were advising the president, what would you say he has to do right now? Because you've criticized him in the past. Waiting for Putin to move first is sure to backfire.
Right. What the deterrence that he and NATO have tried to create in Putin's mind is threats of punishments that will happen after Russian troops cross into Ukraine. And he's threatened severe sanctions. That's one way of trying to establish deterrence. The problem is, looking at what happened after Russia annexed the Crimea in 2014, after they effectively took control of a big chunk of eastern Ukraine, they suffered very little for it. So I'm afraid in Putin's mind, threats of economic sanctions after the fact do not have a deterrent effect. And I think, again, Germany's continued weakness on Nord Stream 2 and other issues reinforces that. So if you want to prevent the invasion, and that should be the objective, you've got to take steps in the here and now, not threatening punishment later, but doing things that change Putin's cost-benefit analysis immediately. And I will say, in the past week, 10 days, the White House and other NATO members have increased and sped up the flow of lethal military assistance to Ukraine. I think that's a positive step. I do think that NATO has to put additional NATO forces in Ukraine, not to fight, but to continue to train and work with Ukrainian forces, as American National Guard units are already doing now and have been doing for some years. I think those Russian generals looking through their field glasses across the border should see a lot of American flags and wonder, what does that mean? Do they really want to risk a confrontation with the United States? And then finally, I think this Nord Stream 2 issue has got to be brought to a head. I think if Germany wants to be part of a united West, we need a statement that no natural gas is going to flow through that pipeline until Russia withdraws military forces from places where they're not wanted, not just Ukraine, but Moldova, Georgia, and others where they're currently occupying parts of these countries.
What do you think about placing troops permanently in the Baltics? I mean, right now, a lot of people don't realize that those battle groups, multinational battle groups, are rotated. They do not have bases in, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. Now there's some talk that, President Biden has put 8,500 troops on standby, maybe to go in and reinforce the Baltics. Could be the 82nd Airborne, for instance. Do you think it's time now to talk about really stepping up and putting bases there and drawing an absolute, clear, very visible sign for Russia that they cannot go back and roll back any NATO membership?
Yeah, I think it's worth reinforcing. Russia or the Soviet Union has never sent military forces across the NATO border. And I wrote the other day, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania ought to be thanking their lucky stars that they got into NATO before Europeans and Americans began to get cold feet over it. George W. Bush proposed bringing Ukraine and Georgia onto a fast track for NATO membership in April of 2008. France and Germany rejected it. In August, Russia invaded Georgia, August of 2008. So I think stronger steps to show the Baltics and to show Russia that the commitment is real or warranted. It's over the decades, the distinction between a military base and troop rotations has gotten pretty thin. When you pre-position supplies and equipment in forward places, the rotation of the troops really becomes functionally equivalent to a base. But calling it a base, having the flag up 365 days a year, I do think has political significance. I think we ought to think of ways to underline that political support for these endangered NATO members.
What do you say to Russians, and I'm sure you probably heard it directly, and to President Putin, who say promises were broken? We were told that NATO would never expand when U.S. Secretary of State Baker met with Gorbachev, although a lot of people say that they were talking about East Germany at the time and the fact that there were Soviet troops there, and Baker was really saying that they wouldn't push NATO forces into East Germany while Soviet troops were still on the ground. But there's different interpretations. Were promises broken?
No, they weren't. I worked for Jim Baker at that time, and I remember this controversy arising. The point he made to Gorbachev was, we will not insert American or other NATO forces into East Germany while then still Soviet forces were still there. In other words, not risking a confrontation unintentionally, because the Soviets were not able to withdraw from Germany as quickly as they wanted to. They didn't have the capability to withdraw. But there was never any commitment not to treat Germany as a completely integrated country after the East and West were united. And all of Germany became a NATO member, not just half of it. Nor were there any limitations on eastward expansion. The first addition from the Warsaw Pact was Hungary. And I remember that very well. The Hungarians, as early as 1990, were coming to people like me in the State Department saying, we don't want to be part of the Eastern European group at the United Nations anymore. We want to join the Western group. I mean, that's how fast things were moving. So, this is a little revisionist history by the Russians. And they may not like the expansion of NATO, but they were never promised it wouldn't happen.
But NATO's threatening them, John, they say. And you were there in the White House when the U.S. withdrew from the INF treaty. I believe you were in the White House at the time, right? And you were a proponent of withdrawing from the INF. And the Russians would say, well, there goes, open skies. There goes another agreement that the U.S. is tearing up. But in fact, what was the reality in terms of the intelligence that you had? Is there any doubt in your mind that Russia was the one that was violating the INF?
Right. At the time, I have long been a supporter of getting out of the INF, and I'm happy to say the Trump administration did withdraw. At that time, there was only one country in the whole world, one country that was bound by the INF treaty, and that's the United States. China wasn't bound by it. Iran, North Korea weren't bound by it. In theory, Russia was, but they had been violating it for 12 or 14 years. They had previously deployed INF violative missiles in the Kaliningrad exclave between Poland and Lithuania. So the history was Russia had violated it very significantly for a long period of time. We faced threats from China, which has a huge rocket force in the intermediate range. And in those circumstances, given we were the only country in the world, I mean, think about that for a minute. We were the only country in the world not building intermediate range missiles. It only made sense to withdraw. Had no offensive aim toward Russia, and it is a fact. It's not just a PR statement. It is a fact. NATO is a defensive alliance, and that is the only purpose it has ever had.
If you listen to a lot of assessments, and I know you do, about what Russia might do, not necessarily a full takeover of Ukraine, but more likely they will push forces into the separatist areas on their border that they have funded, that they have armed, that they have stirred since 2014. If they do a limited incursion, and they'll, of course, they're going to say things like, we are only supporting ethnic Russians there. We are acting as a peacekeeper, as they've tried to suggest through the Minsk Accords, although to everybody else's assessment, they've been an aggressor there. What would you say should the U.S. response be mitigated? Should be any different versus a full invasion than if they just move into those areas, support the so-called rebels, and then that's going to lead to some kind of annexation anyway?
Yeah, well, I'm very worried that's exactly what Putin may do. I think he's got all his options open. He may be content with a diplomatic outcome that increases the splits in NATO. He may be looking somewhere else. This may be a shell game, and we're looking for the pea under one walnut shell, and he's off doing something else in Georgia or Belarus or some other place. Or he may have less than all-out annexation of Ukraine in mind. And this could come in a lot of different fashions. He could come in and simply occupy and or annex the eastern and southern parts of the country where there are a lot of native Russian speakers. He might try to landlock a rump Ukrainian state, take the port of Odessa all the way up to Romania and Moldova, or he could do less than that. He could launch Russian forces from Belarus south into Ukraine to approach the capital, Kiev. The Russians did something similar when they attacked Georgia in 2008 to try and topple the Zelensky government. So he's got a lot of options. But if I had to bet right now, I would bet that some additional substantial part of Ukraine is what he has his eyes on, because he doesn't believe that the post-military action sanctions will be very strong. For the reasons I think you're suggesting, the Germans and others are going to say, oh, is that all there is? That's not so bad. And he will escape. And that's a bad lesson for Putin to learn.
Should the U.S. support some kind of guerrilla movement then to retake those lands, support Ukraine to fight back and take that land back eventually?
Yeah, I think we should look at that very seriously. I think, though, the way Putin structures the territories that he takes over could be important. If he is in areas that, for example, in previous Ukrainian elections have strongly supported pro-Russian candidates, I think he's not going to face much of a guerrilla threat. I think it's more in the western parts of the country where people would resist. But this really is speculation. One thing I agree with Joe Biden on when he said the other day, the final decision here is going to be entirely Putin's, and we just don't know what it is.
Ambassador John Bolton, it's always a gift to have some of your time, and I really appreciate your insights, sir.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I enjoyed it.
All right, joining me now from just outside of Moscow is the Most Honorable Mikhail Kasyanov, who is the former Prime Minister of Russia, and he served under President Putin. from 2000 to 2004. Hi, Mikhail.
Hello.
Does this look like an invasion to you? Is Putin serious about taking back all of or part of Ukraine?
I think it's a serious bluffing game. And in fact, just Mr. Putin wants to achieve some kind of concessions from the West and NATO and the United States in particular, and would like to draw the world's attention to his personal position and his personality. That is the issue. That's why I don't think that Mr. Putin and people around would like to, and ready to make a decision to invade into Ukraine. I think that is a political, very dangerous, bad game.
Why now? I mean, what's he after? Is he seriously expecting the West to roll back NATO membership back to 1997 or before that?
I think that there are two aspects of this. One of them that Mr. Putin, as always, believes that his strength as a president and I would say vertical of power, everything just subordinated to him, and he is capable to make any decision in a quick manner. Other than just Western democracies, where they have to consult with the parliament, consult with their team, etc., and look on the electorate, etc. And that's why he believes that there could not be a unified, principled, serious decision taken in response to his pressure, his fear. And the second, I think that is the important point from my vision is that in 2 years' time, Putin needs reappointment, say elections, be re-elected. And that's why just he needs to impose mobilization spirit in the country. He lost his, I would say, legitimacy inside the country because of the problems what we have in social sphere and economy, and people already declining their real income already 8 years in a row. And that's why for any dictator, that is absolutely a standard situation to impose mobilization spirit and just to create enemies around, so that to explain all his failures to develop the country, explained by external danger, external enemies.
So you're saying it's just a big distraction from his internal political problems?
I think that is expectation of this, because in reality, of course, even his electorate, which always was around 40%. Not 80%, just his core electorate like 40%. It is less educated people in the rural areas, not necessarily rural, but remote from Moscow and other big cities areas. And they now started to understand, these people started to understand that they get nothing. Of course, they approve for Mr. Putin's behavior to create a strong Russia, which the whole world is afraid of Russia's behavior, etc., strong country. But simultaneously, of course, they expected improving on their living standards, which didn't happen at all, and just declining, as I said, real income declining just very rapidly. And 2 years, that means tomorrow. And I think Mr. Putin wants to have long-standing, serious negotiations and just raising his legitimacy out of Russia. And especially he is dreaming to have from time to time regular consultations with President of the United States to demonstrate to people inside Russia that two superpowers again controlling the world, and they're deciding the future of the world. That's what his dream. He born and he grown up and was taught in KGB in Soviet Union, and he knows just all the system what was at that time. And I'm sure he believes to reintegrate some features at least of that period of time, so that to put Russia instead of Soviet Union to the same position when two superpowers discussed just whether to stop war or start somewhere.
Do you believe he has kind of imperialistic notions and dreams about restoring some of the Soviet Union, taking back some of its neighbors?
The main, of course, a feature of his and main belief, that is keeping power. That is main goal. And simultaneously, how to keep power, he uses what he knew from his life, from Soviet Union time. It means imperialistic spirit to create this feeling again among people, and just to trying to collect Russia's lands like it was in Soviet Union time, at least on this and this, I would say, territorial vision. That's why he believed that the sphere of interest or sphere of influence should be restored and respected by the West. It means former republics of Soviet Union. It means all neighboring countries.
How should the West handle him? Do you think that President Biden's threats of, hammer sanctions that Russia has never seen before, collective security, where, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken said yesterday that there is no daylight between the partners in the West, the NATO's allies, that they will stand together and they will not allow Russia to invade Ukraine again. They will not allow Russia to have a veto over NATO membership, or Russia has no right to deny other countries their membership. Are these threats back to Russia, which say, if you go too far this time, we will crush the Russian economy? Is that the right way to deal with Putin? And should the West be waiting for something to happen before they impose those sanctions?
I think that the situation these days is a bit or completely different compared with the reaction of the Western leaders when it happened just during 2008 Georgian invasion into Georgia, or for 2014 Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. It's a different response. I think the Western leaders draw lessons from those events. And right now, they're trying to demonstrate, even in an initial stage, how serious those sanctions could be. And even on the expectation, on the discussions and imagination how these sanctions could affect Russian economy, the Russian market already fall down. And the ruble devaluated considerably within a few days. I think there's people in Russia, and I believe and hope that people around Putin too started to understand how serious it could be, and now just have to, I would say, to wait, to compare what is possible for them, whether it's necessary or whether it's possible to start invasion or some kind of recognition of so-called Donetsk and Lugansk so-called republics, or just to stop there, because just recognition would be treated by the West, it's already clear, as invasion. It means sanctions would impose. And that's why right now, I think that is quite a difficult situation for Mr. Putin these days. They got a response from US and NATO that, as you described, just there could not be any consideration about just limitation on NATO expansion or whatever, sovereignty of other countries and further on. But simultaneously, I think there could be a good way now for Mr. Putin to somehow to simplify and to calm the situation. First, I think Russia should accept Mr. Blinken's request to keep this response confidential. It could mean Russian leaders could say, we got concessions. We got concessions from the West. And we're ready to withdraw our troops, half of that, or stop our military exercises, and we are ready to continue negotiations. And that would calm the whole situation for a period of time. And then, of course, there are some absolutely important subjects for negotiations with NATO and the US in particular, about just, I would say, situation in Europe. Those creating of I wouldn't say trust, but creating some kind of positive attitude to each other. And within the agreement of OSCE, OSCE, just Organization of Security and Democracy in Europe, and that's why just it's absolutely clear.
I can never remember the OSCE either. It's the Organization for Security and Cooperation.
Cooperation and Security.
Europe, I always forget the cooperation part because they don't often cooperate.
although not cooperative, but it's basic agreement. And of course, there are appropriate working group could talk there. And NATO is preparing to discuss this. And I think Russia is also, especially just to discuss this anti-missile systems installing in Europe and how to walk around that and all the things. I think that is the way out for Mr. Putin. We shall see how Russian authority would respond and how they treat this, I would say, confidential, global, comprehensive response of United States and NATO to Putin's ultimatum.
Former Prime Minister, a lot of people say that Putin has lost strategically year by year in Ukraine. He has turned the population largely against Russia. He has failed to break away these rebel areas. The harder he is pushed, the more Ukrainians who have died. He has pushed Ukraine towards NATO and further towards Europe in a more rapid manner. And that this just does not end well, because Ukrainians will fight. And if Russia takes one step into Ukraine, the losses for Russian troops and for Ukrainian soldiers could be very bloody, could be very large.
I agree with that. Just the only thing, I think I wouldn't say Russia should prevent some kind of cooperation or close relations with NATO, because my belief, and when I was in the position, I announced that I dream my country to be a full-fledged member of NATO, because it's organization, political, military organization for security, for global security for all of us. And that's why just the general fear should be just we should be together. We should be cooperative and should create trust among all of us. That's why just the Ukrainian path to NATO and European Union, that's a good way. Another issue for Russia and our future with Ukraine, of course, I agree that Mr. Putin is completely guilty for what he's done with the attitude Ukrainians to Russians and to Russian Federation. He created such a big problem, which would take, I would say, decades to overcome this negative attitude to majority of Ukrainians.
He fears Ukraine, does he not? Because he often talks about these color revolutions, talked about Belarus, talked about Kazakhstan, repeatedly has talked about Ukraine, that there's no more color revolutions. Doesn't he fear democracy on his border?
Yeah, absolutely. Because and I can agree with those who say Ukrainian people quite close to Russian people in terms of mentality too, and understanding the life around, same as the Belarusians. And that's why for Mr. Putin and his authoritarian driving to totalitarian regime, for him is dangerous. If one of those countries, which very similar to Russia, could achieve a democratic development and a successful way and start developing successfully in economic terms too, it would a disaster for Mr. Putin's regime. That's why he cannot allow those countries to move that way. That's why he's so nervous and so serious with respect to Ukraine and Belarus.
Because we're talking about democracy and talking about politics.
Exactly.
You have been involved politically, trying to have an opposition party in Russia, trying to run for president at one point. Now you see Alexei Navalny, who is in prison, and he has been declared an enemy of state. Put essentially on the same level as ISIS or terrorists. Is democracy finished in Russia right now? It has been a very difficult year for opposition members who have had to flee the country or who have been jailed. And is there any room for dissent like yours that still exists there?
Right now, there is no democracy on the streets. There is no democracy in relations between people and government or ruling groups. There is no democracy at all. There is no control by the population what the authorities doing. That's absolutely the case. There is no any single feature of democracy in our country anymore. In terms of potentiality and future, I think of course changes are inevitable, and this period of time to them is very difficult. As you very correctly described, last year we had many problems, including just putting just some activists into jail. Some of them just left country and live abroad just under the fear to be arrested and put in a jail. Elections which took place last year, that was just the worst, I would say, example of imitation of elections. My party, for instance, was denied in the beginning. Just we was announced for 3 months, just denied our state registration, which didn't create a situation we could not participate in elections. And right now, just in all our 60 organizations all over Russia and these different areas of Russia, we have Ministry of Justice checkup. It means, of course, in this period of time, checkup couldn't be positive. It means we're expecting negative results, and which is the next step would be just closure of our country, announcing that there is no such a party, the People's Freedom Party. That's what expectation for upcoming future. That's what I'm saying. When I started discussing just the general attitude and Putin's policy and the goal, I think just a re-inauguration of himself in 2024 for the new presidential term. That is the main goal. And to eliminate any potential risk which could appear during this time, that is the goal of Mr. Putin and his FSB and other secret services working together.
And sadly, he's been very successful. Mikhail Kasyanov, the former prime minister of Russia, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David.
And that's our backstory for this week. Subscribe to the podcast so you get it weekly. And if you want to sponsor one of the broadcasts, let us know. Thanks for listening to Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.